Hello, and welcome to Politics for the People. I'm your host, Michael Striano. Thanks for listening and joining in the conversation. You can find links to our Patreon and Instagram in the show notes and sign up for our weekly newsletter. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't, and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts to help others find the show. Okay, let's get to it. This week's topic is something most people have an opinion on, but we're willing to wager a lot don't know much about. Polls. We constantly hear about polling data, but what does that mean? Odds are most of us haven't been involved in polls, so how can people claim to know what we're thinking if they haven't talked to us? Perhaps the biggest question, why were they so wrong in the last two presidential elections? Are they even worth doing anymore? It's a big topic, but we'll do our best to answer these questions and more without getting too in the weeds. First, a definition. Polls are voluntary questionnaires gauging public sentiment. Basically, how people feel about a topic or individual, or even how much they really care. A small number of people are asked to fill out a questionnaire, and those results are extrapolated to predict how the larger population feels about a candidate, topic, or issue. Polls are most popular during elections, for obvious reasons. Everyone wants to know who will win, and we've come to regard elections as sporting events. There are gurus who know all the details about football teams or racehorses, and tell people the likelihood of one team winning. Polls are where we get the raw data gurus use to make predictions. The actual process of making models projecting election outcomes is another topic that we're not going to get into much right now. We're just going to focus on the actual data itself. So, where does this data come from? Political groups and media companies, even campaigns themselves, hire what are known as pollsters to develop a questionnaire based on the information the client wants. The questions vary, but during an election they almost always contain basic information like party affiliation, past voting behavior, and level of engagement, in addition to the more targeted questions that have been curated. Developing polls has become a science, to the extent that pollsters are careful to consider not just the number of questions, but also their order and even how long the questionnaire will take to complete. The best way to get the most accurate data is to have a responding group that is representative of the population being polled. This has actually proven to be one of the more difficult aspects of polling. Over the past few decades, as technology, lifestyles, and people's relationship with the media have changed, pollsters have seen a shocking decline in response rates. In the 1980s, response rates were estimated to be about 50%. Today, they hover closer to 6, and have been below 10 for some time. Such a low rate makes it almost impossible to create an accurate picture of the electorate, because doing so requires enough representation from different demographic groups to capture the varied opinions within those groups. We hear all the time that no demographic group is monolithic. They have different opinions and ideas. This is where that is most important, because when the samples are limited, some ideas will always be left out. Additionally, distrust towards pollsters and the media in general has reached an all-time high in recent years. More and more voters, especially those leaning Republican, are not willing to take part in polls, meaning a massive portion of the electorate is absent from the data. In order to ensure as few variables as possible in the data they are able to get, pollsters are careful to change the order of questions for different respondents. For example, asking about the Democrat first half the time and the Republican first the other half. Polls will often include questions about which party respondents support, in addition to asking about individual candidates or issues. This might seem arbitrary, but the data can be indicative of ticket splitting, something seen more in 2020 than in recent decades. In fact, ticket splitting has been pointed to as the likely reason for the inaccuracy of congressional polling data in 2020. Clearly, pollsters expected results on the presidential level to trickle down ballot, but the trickle-down theory didn't work, and for the second election in a row, pollsters were left defending their work. As we said earlier, polls are just raw data, so it's important that data be as accurate as possible. There have, of course, been some issues with this in the past. For a couple of decades, there was a phenomenon that came to be known as the Bradley effect. In the 1982 California governor's election, the Democrat was a black man named Tom Bradley, for whom polls projected a much better election night. In the wake of his loss, the prevailing questions were, do voters simply not want to say their vote is racially motivated? And are racially motivated voting demographics less likely to participate in polling? The Bradley effect was very real, but luckily it has been largely non-existent since the mid-2000s. The problem here was respondents were not representative of the overall population of California. One way pollsters combat some of these issues is by weighting the data, giving more weight to some results than others. The goal is to make sure that different demographics are represented in the data as they are in the population. For example, if a town is 50% white and 50% black, the polling data would be weighted to reflect that ratio. Weighting data can work quite well, but it's fairly easy to see how this can be problematic. For starters, if you don't really know what the population at large is, how can you possibly weight the data in an accurate way? And since demographic groups are not monolithic, as we discussed, it's impossible to know if the polls are representative of the ideas within any one group. Pollsters have to weight the data, and they obviously do the best they can. But with only 6% of people responding to the surveys, the weighting has to make up for 94% of the electorate, which is a lot more than the 50% back in the 1980s. So, if the polls aren't necessarily good predictors, do they still have value? Of course. It just might not be in the direction you think. Polls are great tools and provide a lot of value for politicians. Keeping in mind our politicians and elected officials work for us, the people, it's helpful for them to know the public's opinion on various policy issues and topics, and polls are the easiest way to get that information to them. You're not likely to hear politicians talk about it so explicitly, but they're not likely to get on board with broadly unpopular policies. Why? Because we hold the power and they don't want to lose their jobs any more than anyone else. Unfortunately, this idea can be manipulated, and poorly designed polls can be used to justify almost any policy, regardless of how the people actually feel. That's why one potential benchmark for a good issues poll is if they ask how much respondents care about the issues in question. There will always be special interest groups who commission results rather than well-designed polls, so it's always a good idea to check who ran the poll and what was asked before simply accepting the data. Raw data is just that, raw. It hasn't been interpreted or analyzed. Regular listeners will know we always like to take a somewhat historical perspective, so let's take a moment to look at the history of polling. One of the earliest polls to be widely acclaimed was run by the Literary Digest just before the 1916 presidential election. The magazine reached out to their subscriber base and asked them to complete a sample ballot. Based on the replies, they accurately predicted Woodrow Wilson's victory. They managed to repeat their projection successfully until 1936, when the magazine declared Republican Alf Landon would be victorious over the Democrat, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. In those 20 years, the sample size had grown to 2.4 million people, but they skewed towards wealthy Americans and were not representative of the population at large. A small, largely unknown competitor named George Gallup managed to correctly predict the winner with a sample of only 50,000 by ensuring that sample was representative of the electorate as a whole. While Gallup's polls weren't perfect, they did set the stage for the eventually commonplace practice of weighting polls. So, why were polls so off in the 2016 and 2020 presidential races? We've touched on a couple of potential reasons for this: distrust in pollsters and the media, poorly designed polls, and poor weighting of polls. The larger problem here may seem like semantics, but polls don't tell us who will win. They're not predictors, nor were they ever intended to be. They show the sentiments of those who participate at that particular point in time. After the 2016 election, pollsters were widely criticized for ignoring white working-class voters and for weighting the data inaccurately. But it's actually fairly impressive they got as close as they did. Considering they had a 6% response rate, the predictions were almost all within the margin of error, especially the popular vote. Even the 3 states regarded as having given Trump the victory, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, were all within the margin of error listed by pollsters. The margins in 2016 and 2020 weren't new in any way. In fact, they're very similar to what we saw in the mid-20th century, when, in 1948, the Chicago Tribune printed the headline, "Dewey defeats Truman." We're not advocating for polling or pollsters, but the bottom line when you look at the facts is a 15% chance, which is what the New York Times gave Trump in 2016, is still a chance. Polls were not designed to be predictors or offer projections of what will happen. They're a great tool to use, but they shouldn't be considered the be-all, end-all of election results. No story is that simple. So we encourage you to use them for the tools that they are, but take any story with a grain of salt and try to look at it from all sides. Because, as we've seen in back-to-back elections, no one really knows what's going to happen. Thanks for listening, and a special thanks to our patrons on Patreon for your help in making this happen, and all those who have left us a review. Be sure to check out the show notes, where you can sign up for our weekly newsletter and follow us on Instagram at Politics for the People Podcast. Want to help shape the conversation, have a say in episode topics, and get exclusive content, including early access to episodes and live conversations with me? Check the show notes, head on over to our Patreon page, and subscribe for as little as $3. We'll see you Wednesday with our newsletter, and Friday with a brand new episode. Take care.